Now, we're not done with the settings yet. We still have to make correct color settings before we can begin adjusting images. Nothing is worse than thinking everything is adjusted perfectly, only to get a print back that bears no resemblance to what you saw on the screen. These color settings will drastically reduce the chance of that happening. Now, let's take a look at where we can find the color settings, which is up here under Edit, and then come down to Color Settings. And this is what we will see. Now, the area that we want to concern ourselves with most is right here under Working Spaces. Now, Adobe RGB is a wider gamut than, say, sRGB, which means that it has more colors in it. Of course, that's what you're going to shoot in, which is Adobe RGB. So if you shoot in Adobe RGB, certainly you want your color space in Photoshop to be the same thing or larger. Your other choice would be ProPhoto RGB, which is larger than Adobe, but you're going to be fine if you set your working space at Adobe RGB and leave it there. And then you always want to preserve your embedded profiles, because if you're doing it correctly, class, when you do your conversions from RAW into TIFFs, then you want to convert that RAW image into an Adobe RGB 16-bit TIFF, which of course is the profile on the image, and we want to preserve those settings on the image. However, if there is a mismatch between the working space, and when we say working space, we're referring to this area right here. This is called the working space. And when there is a conflict between the working space and the embedded profile, meaning that the image carries an sRGB working space instead of an Adobe RGB working space. We're going to preserve the image's profiles. That's the one that has priority whenever there's a conflict. And you want to know when that conflict arises so you can go forward and make the best choice. Now, if you're going to be doing a series of images, one right after the other, that you know is going to be a conflict, then just come in here and change it and end the problem. So rather than have this little pop-up box come up to ask you if you want to do this or that, just go ahead and change it for the moment and then revert back to Adobe RGB when you're done. That's how flexible the system is. Now let's take a look at what we mean when we say the profile. Let's go now to, I'm going to go to Bridge and take a look at this image, and we imported it as a 16-bit image. It's an RGB image, obviously, and the color profile that's assigned to it is Adobe RGB. So we want to keep that. It's a TIFF image, very, very high resolution. It's got 120 megs of color information in it, or it did before it was transferred to black and white. But the basic profile of this image is that it's 16-bit Adobe RGB, and that's what we want to profile. So when you say an embedded profile, this was what is meant by an embedded profile. So making sure these color settings are set correctly, number one, for your main workflow. Set it to make things go fast and to be convenient, but also with an eye towards quality whenever you make these settings.